I did manage to stop working at Elsevier after 20 years, but it took about 8 years for me to stop. I was working at Elsevier doing books in the humanities and in social sciences for the most of the time before I went on to work in the research and development group. I wrote a paper. The reason I'm here is because a couple of years ago I wrote a paper on humanities, books, humanities, social sciences, which is on that link there. So hopefully when you have a chance to get hold of my slides, you can click on that, and I hope you'll find a readable version of my paper. I'm also doing a thesis with Mike Fiesole at Wolverhampton, which is in a related area. So I'm going to start talking about the humanities, the growth of open access in humanities journals, and how this applies to books, and also digging into what's worked for journals and how we can make that work for books. So we've all seen these graphs. We've gone from a majority open access, closed humanities articles during this period. So, last 10 years, it's been mostly dominated. Humanities articles have been mostly dominated by closed. A couple of years ago, we switched over from mostly closed to being mostly open in terms of journals, just up there. Humanities was one of the last disciplines to switch from being majority closed to being majority open, but it's not the last one. We can be rude about the STEM subjects. This is engineering and technology. They have not yet achieved a majority open. Open access works incredibly well for journals, not just in terms of the numbers, but in terms of the way that it functions. So this is a graph of the amount of citations that open access humanities journals get compared to non-open access journals. And you can see that we have a very significant gap opening up between open and non-open access journals. They get far more citations per article over the course of time. In the next graph, I'm going to show you a few more metrics, but I divide one line by the other to get a ratio, which is what I do in my paper. And here, what I'm showing you is how well those indicators perform for all, actually this is social sciences rather than humanities, pardon. So these are many, many indicators. So not just the citations in the light blue down here, where you're seeing about open access social sciences journals getting about a quarter more citations than you'd have expected, but also we get many, many more citations in policy documents, patents even, about twice as many tweets per open access article, and this persists over the lifetime of an article. So the bottom axis here is the age of the article, so going from 0, the year of publication, up to 11 years after publication. And you can see that open access advantage for social sciences and also humanities journals persists over the lifetime. It has a really significant impact on how we can see the visibility of those articles. Now, as my kids would say to me, even though they're 22 and 19, so what? Well, these observations are rooted really well in science. This is Watson, 2009. We know that good quality Twitter engagement drives journal page views. So when we think about those humanities and social science articles getting twice as many tweets, we know that is driving significantly more traffic through to the journal's pages. More people are seeing those articles, more people are sharing those articles. We also know that typically what we don't see are people arriving at journals' pages through Scopus or Web of Science. On the contrary, for the last 10 years, the traffic has been Google Scholar, Wikipedia, and other search engines like ResearchGate, driving the traffic through to journals' pages. When I worked at Elsevier, we looked at these numbers, and again, in order, it was Google Scholar, it was Wikipedia, it was ResearchGate, I think it was Mendeley after that, and it was after that we started getting into the specialist systems. So we cannot neglect these numbers. They are how people discover our research, whether they are journals or whether they're books. We also know that news coverage, blogging, increases the awareness of research amongst wider communities, also including citing communities. And we know that the stakeholder groups don't have access to Web of Science, don't have access to Scopus. They're using Wikipedia, they're using Google, they're using Twitter to discover research. So we cannot neglect these numbers. It's not just a question of tweets, it is a question of visibility of research and making it available for people to discover it. that open access advantage persists over the course of an article. Again, this is a curve representing 11 years of humanities citations to journals. It persists over the course of over a decade, beginning to close down a little bit, but remember we've only got 1 year's sample at the end of there, 11 years at the beginning, 1 year at the end. But the open access advantage isn't a thing that's just in year one, it persists over the course, and again, I could have chosen any metric and a curve would have been very similar to that. But open access growth hasn't occurred naturally. Now, we all know that. It's not just come about because somebody had a good idea 10, 15, 20 years ago that we could make things open access. It has happened as a consequence of agency and reflecting that agency through the policy of funders. So this is a graph for the top UK funders. Again, this is a cross-section of funding from the UK, the top funding agencies. Finch Report, 2012, just up here. And after that, we start seeing money being made available for APCs, and the consequences are extremely clear to see on this graph. The massive drop in the number of closed journals, represented by the black line, and the massive growth in the number of open access publications. The three principal open access publications being the yellow line, pure gold journals, the orange line, hybrid journals, so open articles appearing in closed journals, green, of course, and the bottom line at the bottom there, the so-called bronze, an interestingly difficult and challenging definition of open access.
Which nation is this?
This is the UK.
This is the UK?
Yeah. This is the top 4 or 5 funders for the UK, and that includes the social sciences and humanities funders. This is an organisation, this is the European Commission. Again, it's their top grants. They don't have a strong gold policy, they have a strong green policy. It's worthwhile noting, by the way, that they tell me that actually they have almost completion for green publishing, but that doesn't show in the metadata. And I want to really come back to the question of this. Now, I trust them. If they tell me that all of those articles are in fact green, and that graph should be significantly different from that, then I have to trust them, but that's not what the data shows. Is this a question of visibility? And this is another country, not a million miles away from here, which doesn't have a clear policy on open access. They're sort of broadly sympathetic, but they don't make anything for funding. So we can see in these graphs that the policy that we have, this is Turkey, by the way, the top Turkish funders, so that we can see in these graphs that the policy, the agency is expressed through policy favouring different types of open access, has a direct relationship with the output of those funded institutions. Policy works as long as it's strong and as long as it's clear. Countries such as Turkey that don't appear to have a clear open access policy don't benefit. I could have chosen a number of different countries for this, happened to choose this one. So those policies, of course, translate into impact because we've already seen that the humanities research gets more impact. So in this case, we're looking at the top funders for this group of countries, also including Austria, I think. And we can see that, for example, the pure gold journals, in terms of citations, perform about as well as the non-open journals, whereas the real benefit is felt through the green open access and through gold hybrid journals. And this is a similar finding as I found through a number of different indicators. So these are policy citations, and again, we see this clear difference between different kinds of open access, but they all do better than closed, and that's the really important takeaway. Now, I could have shown you a wide variety of graphs. I can show you them for books, I can show you them for humanities, I can show you across the disciplines. You get the same issues coming up, that open access always does better than closed. It's always slightly fragmented, and there are definitely disciplinary differences, there are definitely country differences, but generally speaking, all we can say, open access, of whatever type it is, works better than non-open access. And again, thinking about driving Twitter, driving people, making people aware of your humanities research. Again, massive differences here in terms of the visibility. Again, gold journals, green journals, bronze articles, gold articles in closed journals. These all outperform closed research. So the conclusion from this section really is that policy has an enormous impact on what's happening to the numbers of open access. And those policies are directly driving the transparency and visibility of research. Now, what we want to do is to think about what that open access advantage is. How does it come about? Now, we know, because we're in a position of majority, that it's not simply a question of quality. We used to think 10 years ago it was just like people were making their best research available. That was why the advantage was. No longer the case. We know that's definitely not the case. It's not a question of early advantage. Again, showed that in the slides. It's not a question of whether journals are promoting the research or not. It is a question, almost certainly a question of visibility, discoverability, and accessibility, because the numbers are there on Twitter. We can see that people are clicking through to that research. And if I had a couple of hours to talk, I could talk to you about what they're saying on Twitter and how they're making recommendations for their networks and which stakeholder groups are interacting with the research. It is a really impressive set of data. But books have suffered because we don't have these clear policies. We don't have this translation of desire into policy, into action, into impact that we have seen over the course of the last 10 years in journals. So you'll remember at the beginning of my presentation that humanities journals became majority open in about 2019, beating engineering to the snap, probably going to go next year, but a couple of years trailing after life sciences. So humanities journal articles, enormously successful in terms of open access. But sadly, this is the picture, according to Dimensions, of humanities books. We are, maybe, if we are going to be generous. So when I wrote my paper and I went back in time, we were talking about less than 10% of books being open access. Maybe we're touching 15% in some disciplines. But there's a reason why there isn't this, that publishers are doing great things, and we've heard from Ros, we've heard from other people, all of these really interesting business models that are emerging. Researchers want it, but there's no clear policy. For many, many funders, there's no clear policy on open access for books, which is a great shame, because the same phenomena that we see, the same success that we see for humanities journals is true for books. So, okay, there's a lot of noise because these are small percentages, but when you test for significance using the appropriate tests for asymmetry, these are significant curves. So here, for example, we see that open access humanities books are outperforming non-open access for citations. So if you want to get more citations, you are better off being open access. And this is also true for news coverage. It's about twice as high. And it's true for Wikipedia citations. Again, it's about twice as high. And remembering, these are very, very small percentages. I mean, we're going back in time to 2010. From memory, 4% of open access books were open in the humanities in 2010. Very, very small numbers. But even so, outperforming non-open access on an average basis. And it's also true for policy documents, citations from policy documents. Again, clearly outperforming closed humanities books. So even on that very small basis, we've got this great data to drive policy. We're not yet really in a position. I think we're just beginning to see some clear policies emerging. But from my position, I still think they're so far behind the curve, and I'm looking forward to a future where books are celebrated a little bit more. So books, we can see, maintain their relevance in the modern world. They're being used on Twitter, they're being shared on Twitter, they're being used in Wikipedia, they're being cited in policy documents. They are still an exciting, innovative, and important source of impact. But they've lost ground against journals. Again, we see this because journals have grown in open access, because they continue to be grown, because they benefit from clear policies. They are growing disproportionately fast. And books just aren't. Books have not yet grown. We've not seen that same revolution in funding policy for open access books. In terms of those numbers, really there's been no significant movement. I showed you that there's been a small bump in the amount of open access humanities over the last year or two. It is a very small bump, and it's the sort of bump that could easily be, could simply be noise. There are all sorts of issues for visibility of books as well, because of course, as we heard yesterday from, I think, Didier, it's not, putting a PDF on a website is not making a book open access. You have to back it up with the metadata, you have to back it up with the licenses. It has to be part of the academic system. It has to be indexed and discoverable through Google and other systems. Books would benefit enormously from the strategic steps to increase open access publishing. And I believe absolutely that as open access humanities books increases, we will see more activity on social media sites. It will be driving downloads. We will see more citations in policy documents and also in Wikipedia and elsewhere. I could have chosen any attention source. So my conclusions, really, we don't have to think too much about expensive gold options. We don't have to necessarily do that because my data suggests quite strongly that green and gold perform better than closed, and in some cases, green outperforms gold. Green is, in short, as impactful as gold in the humanities. This is an important observation because when we're thinking about what we want to do with the book's economic model and the difficulties of working with books, we can use green and it can be as impactful as gold as long as we get the metadata right. I mentioned the European Commission. You know, they make this assertion that nearly all of their humanities research is available in repositories, but it can't necessarily be found by systems. And that means that it is not accessible to view for people who are just casually looking for research. It may be open, but it's not open with a capital O. So we would do extremely well, not only to agitate and support clearer policies for open access publishing for books, but also better metadata. This is where books is a very, very difficult area. As Anthony mentioned, I wrote a paper with Charles where we did a survey of book metadata a couple of years ago. We estimate that the world of books is underrepresented by about 50% in terms of the metadata. There aren't DOIs, the metadata is locked away. Even if it's available, it's very, very largely incomplete. So often when you do find a book, if you go back and you look specifically for a book on, say, Google Scholar, you might find part of the title. You won't find much of the data. And it means that it's, from an academic's perspective, the question of finding something, looking inside it, all of those things are lost if the metadata is incomplete. So in my view, then what open access books really need is effective, complete policies, and that those should express clear support for open access, no matter what the color it is. We need to be very clear that metadata needs to be mandatory. I was disappointed to read a recent innovative policy on open access books that made clear metadata and clear licenses optional. It should not be optional. That was a mistake. We need to acknowledge the complexities of book culture and economics, and I say this as someone who has worked in books for 20-odd years. And finally, we need book-appropriate definitions for open access, because we still don't have those. We still have folk like Unpaywall, for example, really struggle to classify books properly in open access. And without that, it's really hard for us to monitor the success of open access adoption. And that's the end. Thank you.